Hi there. Welcome to all of you. I have some good news because I have done some investigation. Investigation that's easily available to all of you, but I did it. What prompted this investigation was something I heard from Scott Adams. Now, I had listened to President Trump's speech at Davos, and that was given Tuesday morning European time, or Switzerland time, January 21st. And I've been very, very pleased about what he said about energy, climate change. He didn't say anything about climate change, but the issues involving climate change. So I was surprised when I listened to Scott Adams say something to the effect that the president kind of, accepts that climate change is an issue. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I said, what? That's not what I thought. And to my dismay, because Greg Gutfeld listens to Scott Adams, he kind of repeated the same thing on the 5. So I thought, that's not correct. So I got a transcript of the speech, and oh my gosh, do I love President Trump. As you know, many of you know from my walkaway video, the reason I became a Republican in the first place, and I'm a Republican and conservative now for many other reasons besides this issue, but this was the issue that made me reject the Democratic Party. So I got the transcript. This was available on What's Up With That. It's a site on the web that gave the listeners to that gave links to various parts of the speech. So I'm going to just read the part that has to do with our energy policy. And I'm going to do it, but I'm also going to provide a link in my pinned link so you can listen to it yourself. But you got to really think about each thing that he said very carefully. And I want you to note there is nothing about CO2 and nothing about CO2 being bad. To protect our security and our economy, we are also boldly embracing American energy independence. The United States is now, by far, the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world, by far. It's not even close. I mean, that's just huge. While many European countries struggle with crippling energy costs, that's why I never invest in Europe, as I've mentioned in other places. I mean, they struggle with it. The American energy revolution is saving American families $2,500 every year in lowering electric bills, and numbers that people said couldn't happen, and also, very importantly, prices at the pump. We've been so successful that the United States no longer needs to import energy from hostile nations. From a geopolitical standpoint, that also is huge. With an abundance of American natural gas now available, our European allies no longer have to be vulnerable to unfriendly energy suppliers either. We urge our friends in Europe to use America's vast supply and achieve energy security, with U.S. companies leading the way. We are on the threshold. Now just listen very carefully to what he says next and what he leaves out. We are on the threshold of virtually unlimited reserves of energy, including from traditional fuels, LNG, liquid natural gas, clean coal, next generation nuclear power, that's the Gen 4, and gas hydrate technologies. Do you hear anything about solar, wind, Well, there's other things. Now, some of you may say, what is gas hydrate technologies? That's not available now. But there is in the Department of Energy a gas hydrates R&D program. That has to do with how gas gets under permafrost and under the continental shelves. And I mean, there's a lot of it on the Earth. That's the main key. We just don't access it for energy. So the gas hydrates R&D program is the early stage research. Okay. The commercial viability of gas hydrate reservoirs is not yet known, but will depend on economic conditions in the future. Now, what do you mean by that, economic conditions of the future? If for some reason gas, or oil became scarce, then the price would go up, and then it would be worth it for people to go develop the technologies and the companies to get it out. I mean, that's kind of what happened with the shale revolution. Price of gas was really high at the pump, like in 2000, and then it broke through because now it became economically viable. The program's objective is to encourage the development of technology and methodology to reduce the overall cost of natural gas hydrate development. So that's a potential big source of energy in the future. And it's a fossil fuel. Anyway, so I thought, where did Scott Adams get this idea that he's talking about reducing CO2 or whatever? Okay, now here's what, and I noticed this also in the Q&A after his speech. Whenever kind of questions come up about climate change, he pivots away from the issue of CO2 and President Trump. And he keeps going to clean air and clean water. And hello, that's dear to my heart. That's why I used to consider myself an environmentalist. And we have cleaned up the air and the water amazingly. And the EPA is still doing good work in that area. And he said he pivoted away from CO2. He didn't mention CO2, didn't mention it at all. Clean air and water. And he said we need to be careful about the fumes. Now, fumes is pollution, not CO2, but fumes coming from across the Pacific and garbage in the Pacific, like cleaning up garbage. And obviously when he says coming across the Pacific, he's mainly referring to smog from China, which can blow over here. So I'm proud to report the United States has among the cleanest air and drinking water on Earth. And we're going to keep it that way. And we just came out with a report that at this moment, it's the cleanest it's been in the last 40 years. We're committed to conserving the majesty of God's creation and the natural beauty of our world. Now, I think this is where Scott got it wrong. First of all, I very much support planting trees. Any environmentalists, anyone who cares about our environment, we want to plant trees. We want to plant lots of trees. Today, I'm pleased to announce the United States will join 1 Trillion Trees initiative being launched here at the World Economic Forum. Now, those of you who listen to the speech will see everybody clapped, because the idea of the 1 Trillion Trees initiative is for those who would, they really just want to try to get CO2 out of the air. By the way, just as an aside, there's been several articles about how many trees get cut down for solar farms. Tons of trees. So it's just crazy. But anyway, so President Trump, yeah, we'll join the 1 trillion trees. Let's plant more trees. Now, listen to why he gives the reason, and this is what Scott obviously missed. 1 trillion trees, and in doing so, we will continue to show strong leadership in restoring, growing, and better managing our trees and our forests. Do you hear anything about reducing CO2? There? No. This is not a time for pessimism. This is a time for optimism. Now, this next part I just love it because I do so believe in technological progress and solving the problems of the future, that in that realm, things will just get better and better. Fear and doubt are not, well, but I would say are not good thought processes, because this is a time for tremendous hope and joy and optimism and action. But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. Little Greta was sitting there in the audience, as well as Al Gore and all those people. They are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers. And I have them, and you have them, and we all have had them, and they want us to see us do badly, but we won't let that happen. They predicted an overpopulation crisis in the 1960s, mass starvation in the 70s, and an end of oil in the 1990s. These alarmists, climate alarmism made me walk away. These alarmists always demand the same thing: absolute power to dominate, transform, and control every aspect of our lives. We will never let radical socialists destroy our economy, wreck our country, or eradicate our liberty. For me, this is, I so love what he has to say here. America will always be the proud, strong, and unyielding bastion of freedom. In America, we understand what the pessimists refuse to see. Now, let me just say, at this point in the speech, he had already discussed all the great things going on in the U.S. economy. And you can listen to that in the speech, like I said, that I'll pin the link. That a growing and vibrant market economy focused on the future lifts the human spirit and excites creativity strong enough to overcome any challenge by far. The great scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century, from penicillin to high-yield wheat to modern transportation and breakthrough vaccines, have lifted living standards and saved billions of lives around the world. And we're continuing to work on things that you'll be hearing about in the near future. That, even today, sitting here right now, you wouldn't believe it's possible that we have found the answers. And there's another good paragraph, but I'll skip it. We continue to embrace technology, not to shun it. When people are free to innovate, millions will live longer, happier, healthier lives. For 3 years now, America has shown the world that the path to a prosperous future begins with putting workers first, choosing growth, and freeing entrepreneurs to bring their dreams to life. And then he goes on for a very nice closing. One of the things I think I'll post a link also to a video by an interview with Will Happer. Now, Will Happer worked in the White House, and Will Happer is a strong proponent that we actually need more CO2, not less. And he said he had many discussions with the president, and Dellenpole, I think is his name, asked him, what is the president? Does he believe in the climate stuff? And basically, Will Happer said no, he doesn't. So I actually think Will Happer talking a lot to the president made the president realize that CO2 is not the villain. And I just couldn't be happier. I mean, we've got all this impeachment stuff going on, and I just listened this morning to the president's defense team, and they really, really, really sounded good. It was a pleasure pleasure to listen to them. So and even since he came back from Davos, he's done so many things. I listened to him speak to the mayors. He was great. He spoke at the March for Life rally. He was great. There was something else he did. It just slipped my mind. But anyway, it's like, where does this guy get this energy? I mean, if I go to Europe, you know, I have a little jet lag or something coming back. I've got to deal with that. Okay, there's two other issues. There's two other issues. And I encourage you to listen to the Will Happer. It's really good. So while I'm talking about CO2, let me talk a little bit about, and this was a question someone asked me. Let's see. Who is it that asked me? I'm sorry. I actually take notes on this and who asked me what. Because I'm trying to get to know all of you, what you want to know. Where did I put that? Oh, James Judd. Thank you, James. You said, because I just mentioned CO2 as a control knob, that's just nuts. But, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but here's some key points as to why I don't think that CO2 is a control knob. Like you turn it up, it gets hotter, you turn it down, it gets colder. Because the main reason is there's nothing in Earth's climate history to suggest that CO2 is a control knob. Now what does happen is if it gets warm, more CO2 comes out of the ocean. So sometimes you get, but it's always lag. It's always a lag. It follows the temperature. It doesn't drive the temperature. And don't you think it's kind of interesting that the one item, well, and there's more like methane and other things, that human industry that our economy depends on, our capitalist economy, you would call it, the one thing that gets emitted is the thing that's picked up as the culprit. I mean, nobody's making water vapor the culprit. Water vapor is the biggest greenhouse gas. There's a huge number, nobody's picking sunspots as a culprit because we can't control that. But the one thing that we can control, that's picked as the bugaboo, the villain. Because if you want to stop that, then you completely revamp our whole economy. Like Prince Charles, who's been supported by the British taxpayers as a member of the royal family, like he wants to do with his new economic order. It's just disgusting. Okay, so just from a psychological point of view, the fact that CO2 is a thing that's picked just seems mighty, mighty suspect. And that's what the IPCC reports. You know, they put it in these climate models and they tweak it, and that's what you get. Because in theory, if you double CO2, it's something like a little over 1 degree C. I mean, everything else being equal. But, so, another simple way to think of it, if let's say climate in Earth's history had always been the same, I mean basically just steady, like Al Gore's book in 1992, I think it was, 1991, The Earth in Balance, like everything was perfect, everything was perfectly balanced, everything, the climate. And let's say it had always been the same, which it has not, but let's say it had. If the climate had always been the same, and then suddenly it got warmer in a dramatic way, and the only variable that was different that we could see was CO2 emissions, well, maybe, okay then. We could consider CO2 as a culprit. But unless you can explain what caused all these previous ups and downs, and I'm not talking about major glaciations, that's like the Milankovitch cycles, that's in the past 2.5 million years. I'm talking about since the last glaciation. So, let's just say starting from 12,000 years ago, because the peak of the last one was 20,000 years ago, the last glaciation. I mean, we're talking miles of ice where Chicago is now. I mean, it's huge. That would be a problem. I mean, we've had major warming. We had the Holocene maximum, which when it was probably, it was like 8,000 years ago. Don't quote me on that, but it's on that order. You had the Roman warm period. You know, why do you think they wore those togas and whatever? then you had, I guess, a cooling, but then you had the medieval warm period. And that's when you had the Vikings, you had Greenland, which we'd never call it Greenland now, but it was Greenland. And in Great Britain, we know they had vineyards. They had vineyards to grow grapes, which you cannot do now in Greenland. That was the medieval warm period. Then you had the Little Ice Age, which we started coming out in the 1800s. Well, how did all this happen? What's going on here? It had nothing to do with CO2, and now suddenly, today, it has to do with CO2. And then it's just, as our CO2 levels are increasing, and not very much, we are really very close to CO2 famine. I mean, you have to think about what the term fossil fuels means. Fossils, living things. They got buried. I was talking to a really, really smart guy at Caltech. But he didn't want to get this out, but he was talking to me. And I was expressing my views, and he says, "You are right on, Deborah. Just keep doing what you're doing." But he had this whole thing about the carbon cycle. And he said, it was kind of a natural that so much carbon got buried, because when the plants evolved, they needed and had a lot more carbon. They thrived. And we do know that CO2 is needed to help plants grow. And right now, they just really don't have a lot. That's why we pump more CO2 into greenhouses to get it to grow. And it is a known fact that with the increased CO2 we have now, the Earth has gotten greener. We can see that from space. NASA has shown that. And here's another interesting thing. Plants need less water the more CO2 that you have in the air. Because I guess when they're kind of starved for CO2, they need more water to do something. But I was at a Caltech meeting with a really, really knowledgeable guy speaking. And so I said, "Paul, well, why is it that plants need more water when CO2 levels are higher?" And I could tell everybody in the room was kind of like, what? Is that true? And they looked to Paul. And Paul said, "Oh, Deborah, it's because of the stomata of the plant," and he gave some complicated, but he just accepted it. So that's just something a lot of people don't know. So I actually, my late husband and I, we came up with this kind of nice round number and said, it'd be good if we had 1,000 parts per million CO2. That's probably ideal for the level. But why is it that nobody's studying this? There's no funding to study this. I mean, kind of what would be, with all the variables involved, what would be kind of an ideal CO2 level in the atmosphere? Given the fact that we've had huge levels of CO2 difference. Why do we just assume ipso facto that it's bad? We don't know that it's bad. We only know it's bad because we're putting more out. But, okay, I'm gonna get a little spiritual, religious. Who knows? Maybe we're supposed to do this in some cosmic, spiritual way. I don't know. I mean, what if the cyanobacteria back, 2 billion years ago had said, we're bad because we're changing the atmosphere of the Earth. But it was a cyanobacteria, these little one-celled microbes, that gave us oxygen. We didn't have oxygen before that. We had very low. We didn't have oxygen to speak of in the atmosphere. And they were the precursors to plants, and they gave us the oxygen in the air. Good thing they didn't have a little movement about, this is terrible, we're changing the planet. No, they made the planet better. Maybe we humans are making the planet better. We're certainly making it better for plants. So for that reason, CO2 is not a control knob. And Judith Curry had brought that up. She said that's been the point of view. She's a very good climate scientist. And she said that's been the point of view in the IPCC. That's the UN body that supposedly, has been studying the whole climate issue. But they're not really studying it. that was to give a scientific justification to lowering CO2 levels. But one of the things I found out from, but anyway, back to Judith Curry, sorry, I just stopped there. And she said that's one way of looking at the climate. Her way, and what she came to believe was, you know, it's a complex, nonlinear system, and there's so many things going on. So you can't just put it to one variable. So I really hope you listen to the Will Happer discussion. So, and he's part of the CO2 coalition, and I'm going to look that up because they have a white paper called Think for Yourself, but they think that we need more CO2. And Patrick Moore has talked a lot about that issue as well. So there's a lot of smart people, including myself. Well, whatever. Anyway, a lot of people. And it's just obvious. Otherwise, why would we be putting it in greenhouses? Okay, and the other issue I want to address is the beneficial, and this came out of last week's talk where I talked a little bit about nuclear power. I want to address the issue of hormesis. That's Hormesis. And that's where, I mean, you can talk about it with other issues, but in relation to radiation, nuclear radiation, it's been shown in many, many different studies that there's a beneficial effect in human health to low levels of radiation rather than no levels of radiation. And I want to thank Carrie Thompson and M. Bu Marchis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, but in my last video, they gave some really good comment. They made really good comments, and they referred to some studies that have been done in this area. So I encourage you to go back and find their comments, or Carrie and M. Bu Marchis. If you would just like repost, you know, copy and repost your comment to this video so people can read it, because it's really good. So I dug out, I mean, I have a lot of material on radiation, the benefits of radiation, but this book is pretty good. This kind of summarizes it, and you can see, and going over it, I tagged a lot. And I realized, look, I don't want to get bogged down here, but let me just, because there's actually been many, many epidemiological studies. And what's an epidemiological study? That's a study that says, here's this huge population that's exposed to radiation, background radiation, and here's another huge population that's otherwise the same, but they're not exposed to the same background radiation. So you try to remove all the other variables and say that they're basically the same, but one has, and they did this first with nuclear shipyard workers because they measure the radiation that they get. And in all cases, there was always the thought that the more radiation you got, the worse it was. But they found just the opposite, because if you look at mortality, the people that had low-level radiation had better mortality, meaning they lived longer. That's amazing. Now, where does this come from? There's in physics, and this unfortunately took hold in the area of looking at radiation hazards, called linear no threshold, LNT. And you might ask, what is linear no threshold? Well, linear no threshold, linear, of course, is like a line. It means if this much radiation, you know, occurs, then like every little bit of radiation increase that you get, your risk increases. So a little bit is bad, and then each time, there's no threshold where it's good and then it suddenly gets bad. So that's the no threshold. Well, if you just look in your life, I mean, look at exercise, for example. If you use a linear no threshold and you said, I don't know, you run 100 miles and you have a heart attack and die, So therefore, if you run, I don't know, some short amount, if you're likely to die then you have a, let's say you run 1 mile, you have a 1% chance of dying. Okay, it doesn't work that way. And I really liked one example they gave in this book. They use the example of, let's say you had a cement fence or something. I mean, a fence and a cement floor, and it's 100 feet high, and you jumped off it. And let's say pretty much everybody dies. Well, the way the linear no threshold works is that would say, okay, if you put it to 50 feet, half the people would die. 25 feet, a fourth of the people would die. And you would actually get down to where if it was just this high, there still would be some people dying in a large enough population from stepping off that cement onto the cement. I mean, that's ridiculous, okay? You know, part of that is good. You know, this at the low levels, you're getting some exercise, you're working your muscles, but clearly there's a point where it gets too high and people will start dying. That's a threshold, whatever that is. And Bernard Cohen in the 1990s investigated this, and I have several papers that he's written up in my files, but he mainly started to look at the effect of radon in homes. Now, during that time, there was a lot of talk because the EPA had said, you need to get this radon removal in homes. Maybe some of you remember that. So he wanted to see what was the linear, he just assumed the linear no threshold was right. And to his surprise, and he looked at, I think something like 1,600 homes, anyway, it's all in this book, that the homes that had radon, which is radioactive, actually had lower lung cancer death rates. I guess they just looked at lung cancer. So he said he got rid of his expensive, well, his $1,200 radon detector. I remember when I first learned about this, I thought, wow, I hope I have some radon in this house. And I looked at radon maps in the US, and unfortunately, I don't have enough background radiation. I don't know how to get it for my healthful purposes. You know, I'm always looking for healthy things. I'd like to get some more background radiation. I don't want to get a ton of radiation, but I'd like to have just some steady level background because I think it helps your mortality. So, we're almost at 33 minutes. This has been fun. I've been looking forward to talking to you about this, and I encourage you to listen to these speeches, but also the House impeachment as it is now, because the president's team is really, really good. And thanks for listening. And if you have comments, I'd love to hear them. Thanks. Bye.